Exo Academian is his alias, and I get to talk to an avatar through this whole video. No big deal. Exo still doesn't want to be public yet and reveal his true identity. With that, this is a great conversation. Exo is an amazing dude. Exo puts out a weekly podcast on all the major platforms. He's got a great website called pointofconvergence.net. You're witnessing the first time we've actually spoken to each other. We get to know each other, share stories, and have a great time talking about everything. Well, Exo, can I call you just Exo? Does that work?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, cool. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for jumping on here. And I know, you got a lot to do and a billion other people to talk to and be, but I really appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me. I found you because James Yandoli, he's the guy engaging the phenomenon. He had you on and he's always been talking you up even beforehand. It's like, you got to get on Exo, you got to listen to Exo. And every time he sent me one of your videos, I was just blown away. So I was like, boom, subscribe. And every time you drop one, man, which is weekly, which is great now. What do you got, like 82 or so? I don't even know the number now. What are you up
28,
to?
Not
28.
quite 82.
All right, I got a little dyslexia on that. But yeah, but man, every single one of them's like a home run, dude. Amazing. How long have you been in this whole UFO paranormal world?
Oh boy, good question. Initial interest, a long time, like a couple decades, and
right.
But then kind of sort of like backed off for a while. And then, a few years ago, kind of really got into it again. And then it kind of just, really spiraled into kind of obsession category. And then, when everything spiraled up in 2017 and what's happened since then, just paying really close attention ever since then. And also some of the stuff that, has come out more recently, like from the Free Foundation and the compendium they put out called Beyond UFOs. Not sure if you've read that, but
I have. I've skimmed some of it. I haven't got through the whole thing because it's awesome, but there's a lot.
Yeah, it's like 800 pages or something. But
there's no way I'm gonna. Honest to God, it's some great stuff. But when I get into it, it's just kind of like when I need to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. But that really helps me to connect sort of the larger picture, but like going beyond UFOs, hence right. the title of the book, just like high strangeness in general, consciousness, how it all potentially connects. And so that's when when I sort of backed away from sort of the UFO obsession a couple decades ago, but then I really got into consciousness and spiritual development and that kind of thing. And even how individuals and entire sort of societies, evolve and develop. And really got into integral theory. And so when I came back, I actually found that, wait a second, this all connects somehow, which was even more fascinating.
Yeah.
And even more, you kind of feel, I'll just say I feel kind of led, it feels like these are breadcrumbs being left for me kind of thing.
Yeah.
That somehow are telling me something. And so it's just been an all consuming kind of passion since then.
That's rad, man. I'm not the youngest guy in the world, but I started way back in the day too. Pre-internet, honestly. Before it was just mail-in VHS tapes that we got our hands into, and that's kind of how it started in magazines and things like that. But yeah, and it wasn't honestly until I had my own experience, my own paranormal experience.
Right.
That it really fired it up for me. Right. And it was just like, okay, like you said, it was just kind of like putting it in front of my face. Like, okay, now, you just can't ignore that, and I think that's really kicked off for me. And I've heard it from other interviews before that you had an experience as well. And was your experience that you had more the catalyst, or did you think that you were still kind of down the path, but that was just another thing that kind of kickstarted it for you?
It's so interesting because I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and even what we were just talking about, like when was I sort of like gently pushed towards this?
Right.
Even maybe subconsciously versus, sort of my own conscious intentions. The weird thing is when I had that really anomalous experience with my wife, that was back in like 2005.
Mm-hmm. And if nobody listened to the engaging phenomenon interview, if you don't mind, I mean, I can paraphrase it real quick and you can just stop me and tell me it's wrong. I know it's your story, but basically you're in a hotel room with your wife, you're sleeping, your young daughter's there, your wife's like 8 months pregnant or something. You woke up and you're like, oh, my daughter's going to the bathroom. But then you're like, well, wait a minute, that's not her height. And things started to get a little weird there. Your wife wakes up, kind of sees the same thing, but different than you see. Basically an entity there that's kind of maybe female, certain height, more, you can fill the blanks, please, because I'm messing it up. But basically you walk towards this thing and it kind of just disappears in the wall. And you were like, I'm just going to go back to sleep. And your wife's like, wake up, dude, no way. And you're like, well, okay. And then like, it was an experience. So did I get that kind of right? I mean, please fill in the blanks. Yeah. I mean, I know I was really paraphrasing and just threw it out there, but when I heard that story, I was like, wow, that's pretty awesome,
Yeah. And I'll sort of fill in some of the blanks, and I'll sort of add the parts that I think are most interesting to me that goes sort of beyond the experience itself.
Right. Apologize for just that blah, but I got so excited when I heard it. I jotted all these notes down, and to me, it's
you got the main points right for sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So it was sort of like early morning hours. We were in the process of moving across the country, and this happened in Illinois at the time. And I woke up kind of in that groggy state, and then see somebody at the end of the bed. And I know my wife's beside me. So, the logical conclusion is the only other person in the room is my daughter. But, and what's weird is, and this is again, when I sort of did research into the phenomenon later on, and even some of the research that was done by, the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation,
right.
Helped me understand how much your consciousness is kind of controlled, your perception is kind of altered, your normal reactions seem to be off, and so right. I just, when I think back, I did a whole bunch of things that I wouldn't normally do,
Yeah.
And so I got up and thought, thinking my daughter needs help or something, moved towards this, pretty quickly realized it's not my daughter. And what was interesting too is that this sort of humanoid entity actually looked surprised that I saw it.
Yeah, like it was shocked that you resonated with it. It was just
and it's interesting because I actually had a conversation with James one time.
Yeah.
And he had something similar happen when he was a little kid. There were some entities in his room. I think that was maybe his first experience. Same thing. He said they were like talking and they seemed surprised that he noticed them.
Right. Right.
Which is fascinating to me. And so, which maybe leads you to believe that a lot of these entities are going around, kind of, and not being noticed by most people. Right.
Right. It's like the visibility cloak slipped and they're like, oh, wait, they can see us.
Exactly. Wait a second. He can see us.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh.
So I sort of pursued towards this thing, which was interesting in itself, because normally you would think, you'd be like run the other way.
Right. Yeah.
But I just seemed to be really fascinated more than anything else in that moment. And as I started moving towards it, it started backing up, and then just went towards the wall, then straight back out of the wall, disappeared.
Wow.
And then, what's really strange, and it's really interesting because Ray Hernandez with Free had a similar experience in his case, where he also, after he had this insane experience where he saw a light being show up, and I think if I remember correctly, his wife and dog disappeared along with the light being, but he went ahead and went back up to stairs to bed too. So he came downstairs, saw this light being, saw his wife and his dog and the light being all disappear. He's like, okay, I'm going to go back to sleep. That's the most normal thing in the world. Same thing with me. I just turned around, got back into bed. My wife had seen the whole thing.
Right.
So she shook my shoulder and said, what are you doing? How can you go to sleep right now? And to make a long story short, she kind of shook me out of my stupor.
Right.
Because one thing I'm really fascinated by with these kind of cases is the sort of altered state of consciousness you're in.
Right.
Because none of my decisions made sense. It's almost like, when you're in a dream and you do things that you look back and you go, that's weird that I did that. Or it's weird that this illogical piece matched up with this other piece,
Right.
But this was real life. But I might have thought it was a dream the next morning. In fact, I'm sure I would have thought it was a dream if it were not for the fact that my wife was there too. She saw it, and she should have shook me out of that slumber and said, "What are you doing? We both experienced this. We're not just going back to sleep."
Yeah.
And I was just talking to her about it today, and she wasn't actually initially scared either.
Well, that's
what
amazing.
Happened was we got up and we checked my daughter.
Yeah.
She was still sleeping in her bed. Checked her, and she had welts all over her body.
Ooh.
That we didn't know what they were. Like, we'd never seen anything like it before. Now, it could have just been like an allergic reaction or something,
Right,
but she'd never had that before. It was really strange. So that kind of freaked us out, wondering if it was somehow connected. Right. So we sort of hightailed out of there, and yeah, it was interesting. My wife, clarified for me, she wasn't quite 8 months pregnant. She was a few months along. So,
Gotcha.
But nevertheless, the fact that she was pregnant was really interesting too. Not so much then, but later on when I started really researching the phenomenon, and I started thinking, okay, so because on top of that, my wife definitely has some interesting experiences from her background and stuff even that's happened to her dad. So it's one of those things where you wonder if it's sort of cross-generational,
Yeah, and I've always had that as well too. I mean, my father's always told me that, just from what he's researched and things like that, and he had experiences and supposedly,
really,
other family members, so it feels like, if they were doing some type of cross-generational genetic manipulation or breeding or, whatever, it makes sense to follow. I mean, we do the same thing with wild animals, we tag animals, we let them go, we come back, we test them again, and things like that. So to me, it kind of makes sense scientifically to do something like that. And it, it kind of makes sense to follow that. And I've gone down this rabbit hole, and I really haven't spent the amount of time I need to do the research for it, because there's really not enough scientific data out there. And this is me just being, one of my side theories, or what I've come up with, is that, the majority of people, and I think Grant Cameron kind of pushed me in this direction, was that a lot of experiencers have rhesus negative blood, so they're Rh negative. And it's amazing. I've done just like some Twitter polls and things like that, and it's like a vast majority of people that have had experiences are, rhesus negative. Then you start going into that research, and it's like, because the population is so small, there's, I was trying to do some correlation stuff with, coronavirus, and it's like, it doesn't even exist. I mean, they had a lot of like the A blood type, but nothing about the, the negative part of it. It was like, well, if you have A blood type, you're more likely to contract, COVID or things like that. And it's like, well, what about the rhesus negative? Like, there's not enough of you. We don't care. But to me, I'm like, well, that's a very important thing. I mean, if that's, just from the little microcosm we have in this, society we are, our community, and if that's a big thing, then could that be a marker? Could that be something that they tail, or, I don't know.
And it's one of those things, like you say, that there's just not enough scientific analysis and studies in general. And sometimes it's, even when you get like, you bring AI into the picture, right? And you try and run simulations, you try and pour through a ton of data, right? And just sometimes what the AI is great about doing is finding correlations that we would never see, because like what you and I are doing is going, wait a second, we're noticing some things that are in common, right? There might be like a pinpoint, data piece that's essential, but nobody knows what it is because there's just not the scientific research going into it.
Yeah, and totally. I think that's kind of where I feel with the Rh negative thing. I mean, maybe I'm just biased. I mean, I am, Rh negative, my whole family. It's really bizarre. It was a point where, my wife's, we're both being negative, and my daughter's being negative, obviously. But it's just like, well, what are the, and like, 3 or 4% of the population, like, what are the odds of that? It's like, it's so bizarre that it gets to that point where, it's just, that thing. And it's like, where's the correlation? But so that's kind of my like little, one of the things I have, on the side. It's like, well, I'm trying to find some data that correlates to any of this stuff. And, not that it is, but to me, it's just very interesting. I don't know. It's maybe a potential biomarker. Sorry, I went off on that crazy tangent, but, it's just one of those things where, your wife's pregnant. I mean, it could be. I don't know if you're Rh negative. You could be. Who knows? I
don't know either, actually. I need to check. But
check that. That's amazing too. That's the other conversation I've had. People's like, well, blood type. I'm like, no, okay. And I guess it's not a big deal. I mean, the only time I really found out is when, you donate blood. They give you the card from Red Cross. They'll tell you what it is. But when my wife got pregnant, that's when it was really a big deal, because, if you are, if one of you are positive and one of you are negative, the woman has to have a shot to stop the baby from. So, if she was positive and, and I was negative and she was pregnant, her body would reject the fetus. That's what it rejects it as a foreign body and tries to get rid of it. So they made a special thing that I think it only started in 1939.
Oh, wow.
The 40 or 39 that it was possible to realize. You think back like millennia that wasn't a thing and nobody knew. So like all these babies were, miscarried and who knew? So kind of weird that it itself kept its own bloodline going,
Yeah.
But sorry, that's kind of what I was been into lately. And I'm thinking there's got to be some type of correlation to this, to ancient.
Yeah. I mean, and speaking of correlations, I guess what so a couple things I thought of afterwards was, another one that's really interesting is people who have had a near-death experience are much more likely to have had contact with non-human intelligence or seen a UFO or had an out-of-body experience or have some sort of psi capability, like the fact that like way above average for the population. So
totally.
What is it that's coming online? Again, it sort of begs the question, those who are being contacted, are they being contacted because they have this genetic marker that makes them easier to contact and communicate and perhaps be a conduit? Or is some biomarker being turned on by the ETs and that then therefore, because a lot of people, but even that's kind of confusing because even from near-death experiences where there is no apparent contact with, an alien or something,
right?
People come back. I read a story recently of a woman came back and had a profound experience, but then started having precognitive dreams. She was actually dreaming real plane crashes before they happen, but like the night before, to the point where it's almost impossible to do anything about it.
Right. Yeah.
So that's fascinating because that tells me it's not just something that's sort of like not an implant or something like that. It's more like some sort of modality that comes online. Right. So, but that's fascinating to me. But
totally
the fact that I, one thing I'm really fascinated to, like I said, is the states of consciousness, and how many people is this happening to that don't realize it? Because if I had gone to sleep that night or that morning, if I had gone back to bed, my wife had not sort of shaken me loose kind of thing, I am positive that I would have woken up the next morning, thought that was a weird dream. Must have been some strange pizza the night before or something.
Right.
I guaranteed it would have just vanished from my memory or would have been sort of like, put in this one compartment in the back of my brain that I hardly ever dealt with. And even then, my wife and I talked about it. So here we are. We're not like from some sort of cultural background that has a hard time with these things. We're open-minded, but even we talked about it, but had to put it away for a while because we didn't know what to do with it. Right.
Wow.
It was only years later when I started reading in depth about the phenomenon and how some of these were markers that like line up with so many people's experiences, like strange things like going back to sleep. And then also, the whole point that you wonder with the whole thing with masked memories and blocked memories. One thing we've gone back and forth on, and I'm not sure what your experience is, but we've gone back and forth on whether or not we want to have, hypnotic regressions to see if there's anything before then, we woke up then with an entity in our room when my wife is, several months pregnant,
right?
Knowing that her background has some of the stuff, my daughter has welts over her body. It begs the question: did something
maybe
happen?
We should, prior to this, it might be something. Yeah.
But I kind of go back and forth on that, and it would really have to be the right person, that I really trusted, and I knew they weren't going to ask leading questions, and they really knew what they were doing. So, but what about you? Have you, with your experience, were you fully conscious of it, and have you had any kind of thoughts about regression or what?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think so. The biggest part for me was it was with my wife, and my wife is like not into this at all, right? She's just like, and it's through fear, right? And she'll admit it right now. She's like, I'm just scared. I don't want to know. Like, I don't know what's going to do to me. Like, when I was getting into CE5 for a while, she was really afraid. She's like, don't bring aliens and get us abducted. Like, I don't want me and the baby to get abducted, whatever you're doing. She's just freaking out, I'm like, look, that's not what's going to happen. She just has this, it's just through Hollywood programming and all this other stuff. So,
yeah.
I'm thinking back and she may have been pregnant at the time. I think she might have been, now that I'm thinking about this. Either that or my daughter was like a couple months old. Or maybe not. I don't know. But it's interesting because this is coming back. But basically, right. She was like, I don't want to see this and all this stuff. And I'm like, what's the big deal? Anyway, we're coming across a river, a bunch of orange orbs all over the place. It's sleeting sideways. I think it's Thanksgiving. We're coming back home. She's driving because I was getting drunk, I think. And I'm like, I'm not driving. So she's driving in the rain. It's sleeting sideways. So, immediately she's like, it's Chinese lanterns. I'm like, in the sleet sideways in November, like what, No, her brain starts going through. She's like, it's Christmas lights. It's this. And I'm like, stop the car. Like they're just moving, like, there's a fleet of them, right? And maybe a dozen or so, and they're here and then they disappear, and then they're here and it's just
wow,
all over the place, and I'm like stuck to the window. I'm like, stop the car. But she's so scared. She's white knuckling it. No, I don't see it. No. And just like completely blinders on, like, speeds up, like I can't take it, like speeds up. And honest to God, I've had this conversation with her, like me, just her and I in a room, nobody else around, like nothing. And I'm like, she's like, no, I didn't see that. And I'm like, you did, and it took a while for her to be like, yeah, okay, I don't know what it was though. I drove the next day.
But even then she was worried about even admitting it to herself would mean that it would open something up. Exactly.
That was exactly it. Yeah. And it took, this is another, I'm sure everybody that listens is tired of hearing this, but the other story is it was a year ago, like almost to the day to, yesterday was my daughter. She was 2 at the time. It was laid down on the deck. Never done that before. And just laid flat on the deck and said, Daddy, lay here. I'm like, what the heck? She's like, lay here. So I laid head to head to her. She's like, look. And I looked up and there's a white orb. And I'm like, wow. Oh, and she's like, and she called them yeah-yeahs. I don't know why. She's like, yeah. Huh. And she got up like, okay, no big deal. And I'm like, filming it, binoculars. My stepdaughter walks outside, she's like, hey, look, there's another one. Points over the other side. So there's one in the north and south sky, like right above us. And we're just like, what the hell? Wow. I jumped the fence, I grabbed the neighbor and grabbed him the binoculars. I'm like, look at that. And he's like, I don't know what that is, and then eventually just go, and then, after about like 2 hours, they were there forever, and like, that was another experience. I'm like, okay, the neighbor saw it. All the kids saw it. Like we saw it. And finally she was like, yeah, okay. I don't know what that is, but yeah, I finally saw it. But it took like, that experience for her to be okay with it, because it wasn't like, in her mind, it's like these things are coming, they're going to get her, or they're going to do something to her, so well,
here's another one that happened to me that I haven't told before. And this is another one where the part of the reason why I haven't shared it is because, again, our behavior was so strange. It just makes no sense. You can't explain it afterwards. And I think especially for skeptics, right? They're like, oh, come on. I don't believe that you wouldn't have done this or this or this, grabbed a camera or whatever. Yeah. So this is what happened. My wife, who again, even when she was young, as a teenager, she would have these really crazy experiences. So one time her mom, because her parents at the time were kind of like really kind of conservative Christians, and they were worried that she was like possessed or something, because she had these different experiences. Okay. And so they had a priest come, and then, or their pastor come, and then eventually nothing was helping. So, and they weren't bad experiences. They were just unusual. And sometimes it would keep them up at night kind of thing.
So it wasn't like polter, like it wasn't like exorcist like level stuff, right?
No,
There was
nothing like
flying
that,
off the sheets. And okay.
Yeah. It was all good stuff. It's just that, they kind of were in that mentality that anything, abnormal, unorthodox must be bad. So eventually, she had a sort of a spiritual guide come out, and right away, this woman was like, oh, wow, to my wife, she said, oh, you're a conduit. I feel for you. Because what she meant was, you're one of those people where whether you want it to happen or not, it's going to happen kind of thing through you, kind of like a bridge. Right. And you really have to work at it to, be able to get sleep at night and things like that. So, so my wife has to be aware of that, and she's gotten better at it over time. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so all that said, that's the background with her. So only probably 2 years ago now, I can't remember exactly when it was, but fairly recently, she was upstairs using like a mother drum, shamanic drumming kind of thing, right? Yeah. And which we were into in the past. And she was doing that, and she was just kind of like with my son, and they were like playing these drums, and kind of like inviting benevolent kind of entities kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Not thinking anything really of it kind of thing. And the next thing you know, there's this really weird, super loud humming sound over the house.
Whoa.
And it sounded like a weird kind of rain too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we assumed it was raining, but we didn't have any explanation for what this thing was. And so what's weird is we're walking around the house trying to sort of like keep busy while this crazy loud humming sound is right over the house. And it's like, no one wants to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about it. My wife didn't want to talk about it. My son didn't want to talk about it. Wow. My daughter wasn't home at the time, but we didn't talk about it. It was super loud. And
was it like you had to talk over each other loud? Was it like, hey,
no, not that loud.
Okay.
But just like,
it was there.
You're sort of in the back of your mind going, what on earth?
Like a vacuum cleaner or something
that could be causing this sound at night in the middle of the week. But I kind of did feel kind of a fear, I guess, or just something in me didn't want to go look.
Oh, okay.
Which is strange. That's what I'm saying. I didn't want to go look.
Right.
Neither did my wife. And that's not our usual behavior. So anyway, eventually it stops.
Mm-hmm.
And about 5 minutes after that, my daughter comes in because she's a teenager who can drive.
Gotcha.
She comes in and we're like, wow, was it crazy driving in the rain? And she's like, what do you mean the rain? It's not raining. It wasn't raining at all. And we said, what did that crazy sound? Didn't you hear it? She's like, what sound are you guys talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. So she didn't hear it at all.
Wow.
So we didn't know if it was just like in our consciousness or what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, the next day we ran into our neighbor and my wife was brave enough to say, hey, did you hear anything last night? And the woman said, you mean that crazy loud humming sound?
Wow.
She said, my first thought was UFO, but I didn't want to look.
Wow.
And what's weird is her husband was sitting right next to her and he didn't hear anything.
Wow. Bizarre.
So it's one of the, exactly, totally bizarre. Unusual behavior on our part, but she did the same thing. She heard it and didn't want to look.
Right. Well, and that just leads back to what you were saying before. Sorry about, your consciousness is interacted by these things. It definitely has an influence on your consciousness. I mean, because like you said, why would you just do some random thing that you wouldn't do,
Exactly.
And I think, it definitely has a bigger part to play. I think all of it when I was a kid, it was nuts and bolts, and all this stuff, my dad saw, shit, UFO. When I was a kid, I got raised that they're real. It's a thing. I don't know what they are, but that's a real thing,
right.
So to me, it was nuts and bolts. And then I got older, consciousness had a bigger part to play in it. It's like, there's so much happening around us right now that, we barely even can scratch the surface on with just our five senses, and then when you get into any type of meditation or any type of that activity, you just open up a level that's, just not even a percentage, just a tick above what you're currently at, and even if you just go out and sit in nature and are just quiet and listen, it's amazing what you can pick up, So to me, I think that, it's always around, it's always there, but you're right. I think that somehow, whatever this is, it can definitely affect our physiology, our mental states, our consciousness. And I think that it kind of just, it's almost like surfing in our consciousness. It's almost like our consciousness is almost like a kiddie pool that I can jump into every once in a while.
Yeah, it's really strange. And I'll touch on that surfing consciousness piece in a minute, because I definitely think about it in those terms too. But the way that I look at it in terms of, what's really going on is that, we have evolved to survive as biological beings, right? And to
completely
sort of go from, these really primitive creatures who just needed to hunt and forage and stay alive and, perpetuate the species kind of thing. And so we evolved to filter out 99% of reality, and just take in the small piece that really helps us fulfill those basic functions, at
this exact
and so
moment.
that's the problem is even today in mainstream science, even mainstream scientists, while they might agree with you if you really push them on that point, they still act like, come on, we're seeing reality. What are you describing? And I'm like, well, all we're seeing and experiencing is the 1% that evolution has served up to us, to perform these basic functions. What if there are some people that are beginning to tap an extra like 0.5% or something like that?
Right. Totally.
And when you think about how much is actually being blocked out. And so and even physicists now will admit that what reality is probably actually like versus what our brain serves up, because even we're already one step removed, because already our brains are taking in data and then sort of as an interface giving us back a vision, right?
Right.
And so it's hard for us to think in those terms. But when you start thinking in those terms, and you even what I've tried to do, partly through meditation and just even in waking states, loosen that up a little bit. Like don't be so committed to that sort of previous sort of paradigm. And you start noticing weird stuff. Like it's just like little things happen in the periphery of your vision, kind of thing that normally you would just maybe not even notice because you have not made a mental category for them. So I try and sort of like loosen up that entire process, the categories, the boxes I want to put these things in, and even what I perceive. Wow. And, it's sort of that soft focus you use in meditation.
Right.
Try and walk through the world with that.
Like a waking state, walking through the world that
way.
Okay.
Exactly.
Wow.
And when I do it specifically in meditative states, I often find that it feels like, someone's grabbed the controller on the TV and they're going, and they're just flipping through the channels. So I haven't got to the point yet where I feel like I can stabilize a channel.
Yeah.
But I feel like I'm sometimes just seeing one picture for a few seconds, another picture. And what's weird is they sometimes feel familiar, but I have no idea how they're familiar.
Oh, wow. So that's bizarre that you said that. So it's really bizarre that you said that in the description that you gave, because, I've never said this, but I don't care. I have ADHD, right?
Okay.
And I wasn't diagnosed until I was probably like 20,
right?
21 or something like that, right? So the whole time I was a kid, whatever. And then I took the test and they're like, "Oh yeah, you have it." I'm like, "Well, shit, okay, whatever."
Right.
But somebody's actually, the way I've described it to people that don't have it, and it's bizarre. I use that exact same metaphor. Is I feel like I have the remote control and I'm switching the channel, and it's just like somebody's just going switch. Right. Switch, right. And it's like that all the time. And it's been like that my entire life, but it's always, it's always like that. And the medication does help because it helps me to focus on the channel I need to, or I would like to. Okay. Right. Because if not, it's just a constant, you're right. It's just somebody going, boom, 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 boom.
Right.
But it's really bizarre that you said that, because that's literally how I feel, because it just feels like, and I think that's a good analogy for people that don't have ADD. It's like you're just hitting the channels, but interesting synchronicity here that's kind of how I don't know.
And it's one of those things
my brain operates that way already. I don't know.
Yeah. And what's weird is because it's such a subtle state, again, I'm super fascinated by different modalities, different states of consciousness. I really try and move away from the prejudice we have in Western civilization for waking states. I think they're way overrated or, overvalued. Right. So what I feel like is because these are such subtle states, if I can get into that sort of like, soft focus kind of thing, then it's more like my consciousness sort of drifts out and sort of joins the stream of consciousness, and then I'm kind of like and then time and space don't exist. And so that's why I feel like maybe it's sort of just jumping around, and it could be anywhere and any time. And if I try and go, whoa, what was that? That is the weirdest structure. Then I come out of it.
Oh, wow.
Because then I come out of that subtle state because I've used too much intentionality and it pulls me out of it.
Too much focus.
Yeah. So I'm trying to find that fine balance, to be able to stay in it, experience it, make note of it without like getting so focused that I pull myself out of it.
Well, that's amazing, man. That's a really great practice. I mean, I think that I should try that as well, a little bit more, and just to see if it helps. I mean, it's bizarre because sometimes I think maybe the medicine is a hindrance. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, if I don't take it, my wife's like, "What the hell's your problem today?" I mean, it's definitely apparent. Okay. So it's like, I'm kind of like that, but I mean, I have some kind of stream of consciousness things that, I ended up recording, just joking, messing around in college, my buddies with video cameras and stuff, of just saying the most bizarre, weird, funny or weird things that just come out of me, So I don't know if that was me tapping into it or it tapping into me, but I don't know. I think that all of it has this really, really high level of the Hermetic principle, honestly, as above, so below. I think that really is a huge factor in all of this. And I think that, while everything, current events aside, obviously, the report came out and, great video, by the way. Your last video was amazing, knocked it out of the park. I mean, I think that was great. I think that, you and I and others in the community, we get caught. I mean, I don't think I'm not, saying you do this, but me, I sometimes get caught up and I go, yeah, this is not what I wanted. But I mean, for like the layperson, like people like my wife, it's like, this is what they need. It's like, yeah, UFOs are real. Yeah, we don't know what they are. I mean, people have been wanting to hear that forever, and we're just going, that's not enough. But, other people are like, yeah, okay, cool. So it just starts the ball, it starts the conversation, because, if the next day they come out that says, hey, these things can interact with you consciously, can walk through your walls, transport you through space and time. Oh, and these things are time machines too. People would just lose it. I don't think anybody could.
Right. It's one of those things where you let the genie out of this bottle and you don't know where it stops, because of what we were saying before, where somehow this is connected to everything. In some way. It really, it like I said in that most recent podcast, it ends up collapsing the mainstream worldview, because there's nothing left intact, basically the way we used to look at things. There's nothing it doesn't touch, life, death, consciousness, what's real, what's not.
Right.
How valuable is a waking state versus a dream state? When the free study came out, and the majority of people's experiences happened in some sort of, again, even then we wrestle with words, right? Because at the end of the day, you still have to try and this is again where I get fascinated. We have to attach it to something a hook that we already have.
Yeah, totally.
So we might say altered state of consciousness, or we might say alternate realm. You might, sometimes now we'll use the expression like a virtual reality or a simulation, right? Because we have now the metaphors with the matrix and whatnot, and the way that computer systems have developed. Now we have these, kind of analogies. But even then, that we have to be careful not to get too wedded to those, because that is just our most recent. Just like now, everyone wants to say, that UFO, that's probably just a drone, right? Because drones now are the big thing.
Right.
And it's like, well, it just amazes me how much we can only sort of extend our imagination within about 30 years of our current technology. After that, we just sort of like go blank. And so when you think about the fact that we may be dealing with civilizations that are millions or billions, then it just gets to the point where anything is possible, and basically reality is completely malleable at that point. So,
and language is a complete barrier to all of this.
Right.
I mean, totally. Like you said, it's a drone. I mean, the drone didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, it wasn't in the common vocabulary. Maybe 15 years ago, it wasn't in the common vocabulary, but now it's a common term, and, it harkens back to me to a lot of this experience, like a lot of the children that have experiences with, the landings, like, South Africa and all these, Australia, everywhere else that this happened, is that whatever these beings were, they were communicating through photos, and telepathy was just pictures. It was just symbols. Right. It was just, blah, 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 give it to you quick, like the channel switching on the TV, it's just, it's because you yourself will cognitively probably create the words and the narrative that you need without having to rely on a language or a word, a descriptor for whatever the experience or whatever that needs to be. And I think that's probably hard. It's really hard for people to grasp as well. Because like you said, everybody has to call it. So we have to have a hook to put this on, because if not, we just take it. And scientific, and academia does the same thing. Well, this doesn't fit into any one of these boxes, so we're just going to throw it out over here because, it's probably something, but we can't, nobody's going to give me any money to research that Exo Academia. I mean, do you have experience in academia yourself? I mean, I know I don't want to push the button too hard to get into your background, and I know you want to remain as anonymous as you can. But if you do have experience in that world, from what I understand, it's a very narrow box that everything has to fit in, or it doesn't belong.
Absolutely, and one of it's funny sometimes. When they talk about, for instance, when you try and communicate the idea of water to a fish, they won't know what you're talking about. Because it's their entire world, right?
Right.
And in my background, some of it was philosophy, some of it was psychology, some of it was religious studies. And in the religious studies faculty, for instance, again, and I've talked about this in a couple of my different podcasts where we talk about different sort of developmental levels, right? So academic circles tend to follow sort of a modernist mindset, right? And so it's assumed that, so my religious studies was not coming from a religious point of view. It was coming from an academic point of view, right? So
gotcha.
We would study these as ancient texts, right? Biblical texts and whatnot, and even older than that. And then talk about what process brought about the writing of these texts. And one of the assumptions is, for instance, because this is the thing with any endeavor, right? Any field of inquiry, you're going to begin with some assumptions. You just have to. And again, like the fish in water, it becomes so ubiquitous that people stop remembering that there are assumptions they have. So even right now, you know, scientific materialists forget that there's assumptions they're bringing to the table, right? So anyway, long story short, one of the things I found at the time, you know, one of the things you're taught is that, so now we might look back, and Jacques Vallée and others have done a lot of work on, could these be ancient experiences with ETs, right? Or with ultradimensionals, or whatever you want to call them, right?
Right.
But the thing is, again, from a modernist point of view, that just wasn't possible. That was considered not possible. So they basically assumed there's evidence for this. And then when you actually think about it, it seems a bit of a stretch, but the assumption was, okay, these people are freaked out by thunderstorms, by crops getting wrecked, you know, by babies dying, like you just talked about, because there wasn't the right, you know, vaccine or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they start making up stories to try and pacify their tribes, basically. That's the idea that I was taught about, right? And then eventually this starts as oral tradition and eventually gets passed down and get written down as text. And people eventually look back at this as sort of like holy writ, you know, like this is, we really need to trust this dogma. But the idea was, it began basically as people just making up stories. Of course, when you actually read those accounts, you go, in some ways it makes more sense that they had some really phenomenal experience. And sure, maybe how they interpreted it was determined partly by their background and their culture. That's all fair, right? Again, the hook's there too, right?
Right.
But something happened. But the thing is, that again, because of that prejudice in academia, when I was learning, that was one of the assumptions, and it's a big one.
Oh, huge. That's got to be huge. I mean, and then, you know, while you were, you know, speaking just a minute ago, something came to me as well, is like, well, how do we know, or not know, there's no way to know, that the people that are having these experiences are not having their consciousness altered the same way that you did in that hotel room?
Right.
Or all these other examples, right? I mean, and into the context that they, you know, Jacob's Ladder, for example, right? The story of Jacob's Ladder. How do you know that's not a, you know, an entity, or, you know, ultra-terrestrial, extraterrestrial, whatever, manipulating somebody's consciousness to give them this experience? And
exactly.
And that becomes the mythos, because it's such a great experience. And, you know, maybe somebody else saw it too, you know, and maybe, you know, it was a wider event. But I mean, nobody puts those glasses on in academia and looks at it from that perspective, because there's no, to be fair, there's no way to like nail that down to prove that out, you know?
Well, and if you start asking those kind of questions, you know, academics get nervous, because again, those basic assumptions are the bedrock upon which the entire, you know, edifice of academia is built. So completely. you start really encouraging that. And the next thing people are going to be very quickly saying, should we even be funding, you know, universities and research? Shouldn't we be pouring all of our money into consciousness now? You know, because that's actually the bedrock, and everything else is just sort of like a byproduct.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, we're just beginning. And to your point earlier, when it comes to your wife and different people are hearing this stuff, yeah, we have to remember that this is going to be new to a lot of people. And it's unrealistic for us to think that they're really going to, like, when I hear some people saying, I hope they say this or this or this in the report. And I'm thinking, there's no way, because you guaranteed that got vetted, you know, by people who have sociological backgrounds and know exactly how that's going to impact, right?
Yeah.
Large groups of people. And that's why they deliberately, to some degree, spoke out of both sides of their mouth, because it did enough to desensitize people a little bit, right? And that's what I think they're trying to do, is slowly desensitize people to the idea so that when they do get more confirmation later, it's less of a shock. Exactly.
Right. Completely. My dad always, I keep going back to my dad because basically, the guy's 81. He's just my whole life, just been kind of following his lead on a lot of this stuff. But, he's always said, and this was even before I even saw it in any literature or anything else, that, Hollywood and television has been slowly just, trying to, indoctrinate, the public.
Right.
This is what, don't be afraid of this. This is what this is, E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, any of the giant movies, which, I complete weird segue, but this, I wanted to bring this up. Did you watch the whole 3-hour live, 3-channel, UFOs, declassified, extravaganza that was on, a week ago or so?
I did not know.
Oh, wow. It was on, and I wasn't either because I'm like, I kind of know all this stuff anyway. But I had my dad and all these other people going, you got to watch it. Because it was basically geared towards the mainstream. It was kind of like, okay.
Right. I saw the highlights afterwards, but I didn't watch the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's all you need to really see. But one of the things that really struck me on the whole entire thing is that Tom DeLonge was on there for literally probably 25 seconds.
Right.
And he came out and said, I want to focus on movies because that's how we just tell stories, and people get involved in movies, and people, shapes their beliefs and their lives. And, I'm paraphrasing here, right? But he wasn't on 20 seconds, right? 20 seconds to just talk about, hey, I want to focus on movies. I want to do this. And if you look at all the things that have happened at TTSA, where everybody's left, DeLonge's come out and said, hey, I want to focus on movies and all this stuff. That's a real, a tangible thing from what I've, and I started getting into it a little bit and started doing a little bit of research that, people watch movies, they have that shared memory experience where they don't know if they really experienced it or if it was a movie or a shared memory. And I can't remember, I'm losing the terminology here, but basically, movies influence people in a way that they have false memories or could create false memories.
Right. Like Diana Pistolko talked about in American Cosmic. Right.
Exactly. So I wonder if DeLonge, and part of his grand whole scheme of things was kind of like, we'll get it out there so that people accept it, but I want to go crazy with it. And I want to get these real stories out, but I want to do it in a fictional way. And these movies, like the movies that he had. And then, because we're close to the same age, experience too. When you saw E.T., you saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and all these other movies, Flight of the Navigator, and you kind of felt really like, wow, part of it emotionally. Right. And I wonder if that was his pitch to kind of like, I'm going to do this. But first, before, here's the bedrock is get Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon and everybody out there in Congress and everybody to know, hey, it's real. And I'm going to come in on the backside and go, here's what's really going on with these movies that gets everybody either consciously or subconsciously elevated or put on that level that they need to be. That was just what I came up with in the past 24 hours.
Well, it's interesting too. And I always thought it was weird how the whole take coming out of TTSA was that DeLonge and crew were being used as agents to help disseminate information, but it would mix in sort of truth in fiction,
right? So
that there was still plausible deniability, right? So that if you would never have to go back to an official and say, are you saying, that these are interdimensional? And they're saying, what are you talking about? It's just a movie, right? Yeah. But that doesn't matter because they're not going to get asked because it's a movie, right?
Right.
But like you're saying, it's still going to enter people's consciousness now. It's still going to get into their memory banks, and they're not even going to, after a while, remember, was that something I heard on ABC on a news, or was it actually a movie? It won't matter because it's already there. And so it's laid the groundwork. So again, in terms of desensitization, when stuff gets confirmed, it's less of a shock.
Oh yeah. Is it actually, in your mind? And I think you touched about it on your last podcast as well. It's just the whole entire, I'm losing the hook, right, for the word, but basically it's kind of like the humans have to level up because something's happening that some of us are getting there, whatever's happening, whatever the cause is that these things are not slowing down, they're increasing. And I think that the way to do that is to get that message or whatever it is, or manage the message in a way. And that's what kind of bothers me. And it doesn't bother me too much, but it bothers me into, well, what do you believe? Do you believe the narrative that they're trying to push because they want you to go down this road to believe all these things are going on, and these interdimensionals are great, they're good, they're here for us, everything's peace and love and happy? Or is it the opposite because they're not? And where do you go? Everybody's kind of flipped the switch recently. DeLong has said multiple times that I used to like UFOs, but now I don't. I thought they were cool, but now I don't. And one of Lou Elizondo's recent quotes is, like, what would describe your mood, or what would people feel? He said somber, and
right.
It would seek religion, and some would seek religion and things like that. And it's like, we're going back to the War of the Worlds, or what's going on? There's probably a negative part, there's probably a positive part of this whole thing, just like, as above, so below, the dichotomy of the whole thing. But I think for each person, they have to kind of go within themselves, and people aren't used to going within themselves. People are used to listen to authority in academia and things telling you, this is how this is, whatever. And people aren't used to having self-reflection or, any type of thing like that. So how are they going to push that?
And then you add to that, what if, what I think about too, I plan to do a podcast on this at some point, but it's a tricky one because you don't want to offend people. But I have sort of this notion of what I would call like an energetic immune system that some people, some people are willing to admit it, right? They're just fearful in general.
Oh yeah.
And because this partly involves subtle states, right? You, to some degree, you become a co-author of the experience. So if you're bringing a lot of fear to it, that can, without any intention on the other, entity's part, can really change your experience,
Totally.
And even Whitley Strieber's talked about, his initial encounter, he described as rape, like he just said flat out, that's what it was like, super traumatic. And yet,
and demonic too, I think was his frame of reference, right?
Yes.
It was demonic, yeah.
Yes, but what's fascinating, and again, this came up in the free experiencer study again, he says, though, overall, given enough time and perspective, he sees it as a positive overall experience. It's been extremely transformative, and he calls it basically the deepest stressor a human being can experience without being. So it's not physically dangerous, he says, but it feels psychologically and spiritually dangerous, to your core, because it shakes everything you believe about what reality is, right?
Right.
And yet he says, he sort of looks at like as, generating torque, that it's that degree of torque is necessary to generate the most massive amount of transformation. So that's, and so I don't like to tell people who have had bad experiences that they're not bad, because that's not fair. And, there have been bad experiences, but there's also been people like the Whitley Striebers who, come away going, no doubt the initial experience is highly traumatic, and yet the outcome can be positive depending on how it's sort of spun. Mm-hmm. But all that is to say, I think even he said, though, what I was trying to get at was, his initial experience probably would have been different if he had approached it differently, if he had been more, less, fearful, anxiety ridden.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's hard to ask someone, because again, like even for me, when I remember that thing over the house, John could have showed up at my front door and said, yo, just chill out. It's okay.
Yeah.
Like, don't be so, it wouldn't have worked. I guarantee it wouldn't have worked at that moment, So here I can get on a podcast and I can say these things, and I believe them, but I also know what it feels like to be in that moment. And you're sort of like lizard brain is going, get the heck out of here. Fight or flight. Like I literally, when I'm in my meditative states and I'm sort of like even trying to initiate some sort of contact, I have to sort of negotiate. And then again, in psychology, one of the things we learned about is like the different aspects of the different like biological parts of the brain like grew over each other, right? Mm-hmm. So our most base brain is at the most base level inside of our skull.
The lizard, the fight or flight. Yeah, right.
Right. So you almost feel like you actually have to negotiate a conversation between these different parts of your brain, saying, listen, lizard brain, I know you're flipping out. This is not a good idea, right? But just trust me here. And it really is this kind of wrestling that goes on. But all that is to say, coming back to your initial point, a big part that I bring to it comes back to my background in integral theory and in sort of the spectrum of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've talked about in the podcast quite a bit is how there's this really interesting data that shows that human consciousness, both for individuals and for entire societies, develops in predictable ways through predictable stages. And you see it time and time and time again. And it doesn't always move forward. You can have actually regressions, like after 9/11, the entire sort of consciousness of American society actually shifted back about one level, because we went into, hey, we feel great about life, everything's moving forward, to suddenly, crap, we've got enemies that are like, destroying our cities. People were like, let's, invest in the military. Let's give the military as much authority as they want. Who cares about, personal freedoms? We were willing to grant all that because we sort of dropped back a level. We regressed, so it doesn't always move forward. But over time, given that your basic needs, your security, your physical safety are met, you will progress forward, kind of thing. And again, speaking of assumptions that we all begins with something, right?
Right.
So based on that, and based on the studies I've done and my spiritual background and integral theory that I've looked into, my take is that that's more of like a cosmic constant, that, duality is mostly an illusion, and consciousness is one ultimately. And so a gray alien at some point is accessing the same source of consciousness that I am and that Jon is. And so, yes, like you said, there's going to be good and bad. And just like if you go in the jungle, if someone says, listen, I'm thinking about going to the Amazon, this person says it's all love and light. This person says, no way, dude. There's like some really badass snakes in there. You don't want to go in. And some spiders the size of like your skull. You don't want to go in there. Both are true, right? It's amazing. It's beautiful. It's colorful. It's full of life. It'll change your life, but it can also kill you. It's like you have to be aware of your surroundings. So that's sort of the way I look at it, is that it's hazardous without it being necessarily a threat, is the way I look at it, kind of thing.
Well,
but all that is to say, I think we're going to find a spectrum of consciousness. In other words, highly conscious, some of them way more highly conscious than we are, definitely coming from a place of oneness and here to help us and help sort of facilitate our evolution into sort of the next stage of being. And you'll get some that are sort of lower down and more selfish, kind of like we are. So I think you're going to get all of the above, and you have to exercise discernment. But I definitely don't buy into the all aliens are here to ultimately kill us or take over the earth or turn us into zombies, basically. That doesn't fit with my understanding of how consciousness works.
No, I completely agree. It's funny they said that about a jungle too, because one of the things we talked about early on in the conversation was, our abilities, our human abilities to filter out 99% of anything that was dangerous to us. And I remember early on reading some type of scientific journal was that, humans' sight ability was actually to see through the jungle, to see predators and prey through the jungle. And one of the examples was like, well, just hold your hand out to your eyes, your face,
Right.
And if you focus at a different length, you could literally see all around your fingers. You could see you could see my face. I could see, your icon here. I mean, I could see everything. If you hold it at the right angle and you get your eyes just right. I mean, try it sometime. Just put your hand up and stick it out in a forest or something, and you could see all around it at some point. So your eyes can do that. And it was one of those things where it's like, wow, that's amazing. How come I've never thought about that in my life? Is just stick my hand out and see if I can see through it. You can see through it. You can see through your hand. And
speaking of the jungle, you just reminded me of a really super interesting analogy that I like to use for people. And that is, the first color we got really good about distinguishing was green, because of what you just said, because we were in the jungle. Right. And if there's ever a color that we need for the sake of survival to be able to distinguish between, is that olive green, is that, forest green, is when we're in the jungle. And so it was a survival mechanism. And, the color blue, actually, our earliest ancestors didn't even perceive at all.
They didn't have a word for it. There wasn't a word to describe it, right? Was that what it was? I think.
Well, it's just like they literally no, that part of the spectrum they just didn't see at all. It wasn't just that they didn't have a word for it. They
just couldn't visualize it.
Yeah, it came online later, right? Just like we're seeing now, some people demonstrating capacities that go beyond the average, we have to remember there are capacities we have now that didn't used to be the case for our ancestors, and so now that we have most of our basic needs met, most of us, then it allows our beings to sort of like begin to branch out into these other areas. And it just reminds you that there are capacities that could be coming online that might be dormant even,
That's amazing. Oh, that's great. And then if you have these things come at you and manipulate you or your family for about, I don't know, 100 generations and turning them on, coming through your walls and helping you out, probably speeds up the whole process too.
Yeah. I mean, but like you said, you talked about, your wife's reaction is fear. I mean, my wife's parents, my wife is online with me. So she's not fearful, but her parents totally are. So, and her dad is the one we think that it sort of came through initially.
Right.
And he's
still to this day, right?
The spectrum of consciousness, he's at a lower level of consciousness. Okay. Mm-hmm. So again, anything abnormal to him is just freaky, period. Like,
wow,
you can't talk to him about anything anomalous and him not go, that scares the hell out of me. Why do you want to talk about that at all? Like, so for you and I, we're fascinated, right? We could talk about it for hours.
Right.
But some people are like, I don't want to go there. You're opening a door by even talking about it, right? And so that's the way he is too. So it's difficult. We pulled some details from him sort of in passing, but eventually he's like, that's it. I'm not talking about it anymore,
Wow. Well, and and I've talked about this a few times, but early on when I was younger, I saw what I thought were ghosts, spirits, whatever, dead people, what I was assumed from media, right? It's a lady, she's white. I can see through her. It's a ghost.
Right.
So I had that experience and it would scare the shit out of me when I was a kid, we lived in an older house. I thought it was a lady that was haunting the house, whatever. I met a lady, I was on the radio for a little while. I met a lady, who came in, she wrote a whole bunch of books called Haunted Ohio. I live in Ohio, Chris Woodyard, and, really nice lady. We did it. It was, Halloween. So we had her in, we're talking about Ohio haunted, books and all the haunted places and, promoting her book. Off the air, I'm like, hey, I've been seeing this stuff as a kid. I was even seeing stuff then. I was still only like 18 or something at the time, 19. And I'm like, I was still seeing, like, literally to this day, like last night I saw some stuff and she's like, you can turn it off. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, you can just turn it off. You just don't want to see it anymore. Just say you don't want to see it anymore. Just tell it to go away. You don't want to see it anymore. Just turn it off. I'm like, really? She's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, cool. So I'm like, I don't want to see this shit anymore. So to me, I was like, cool. And like, anytime I have that experience, I'm like, no, go away. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. Go away. And there's probably a good 10 years of my life that I didn't have any experience like that. It was just,
same thing for my wife. Yeah.
Really? Oh, really? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thing? I mean, same thing that's even when we lived in California a few years ago, she went and saw someone who actually said,
turn it off.
Use these various rituals if you want. Use some sage, burn some sage in your room if you want, whatever you need to do, and just take authority because, you're not a victim to this. And if you sort of lay down the ground rules, that's just the way it works.
Yeah. And that literally happened. And what I found is that it was harder to turn it on, to turn it back on. Cause I was like, I started getting into this more and more and, with the internet and everything, I started getting more into it more. And I was like, wow, I kind of want to experience this stuff. I kind of want to bring it back. And I was like, man, this sucks. Like, it's not as easy as it was before when I just see people walk, in the room, and it wasn't until I had that experience with my wife with the orbs that it was kind of like, okay, I remember what this is. It was kind of like I wonder if it was like a jog of the memory or the latent consciousness ability that needed to get kickstarted again. But it was like, yeah, this is this, this is what happens. And I think kids are weirdly way closer to the whole thing than we are, obviously on multiple levels because they don't have the preconceived, notions. They don't have the language, they don't have the hooks. They don't have any of these things that are already there. It just is what it is. It's, it's a,
yeah. And that's exactly what I was getting at when I'm trying to loosen up my categorical thinking. That's what I'm trying to do. In some ways, it's becoming more childlike in that kind of perspective, which interestingly, Jesus talked about that.
Yeah. Becoming like a child. Right. Yeah.
Right. And so, and I think also if these others are working with us over generations, it makes sense they would start therefore when we're children because there's less hardwiring then, right? That's when there's more of an open slate and more can be sort of built in then, more can be planted then that'll actually really affect the ultimate development.
Oh, completely. Yeah, no, I totally believe that as well. I think that that's probably the foundation. And then along with it, if you add that trifecta, you have the media, you have the movies, you have, common culture, pop culture. I mean, I think back, it's interesting when you think back to like the 90s, the gray alien, obviously, that kind of gray alien. I mean, that was, Whitley Strieber's book really popped that out into pop culture. But then like, if you look in the 90s, there's like t-shirts and bumper stickers and it's on everything. It's like in every, it's just, that's the alien now. That's like, it was typecast.
A quintessential image. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. It was just boom, that's it, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that's an alien. Like my 3-year-old, never told her what I was before. Show her a picture of a gray with big eyes, alien. Right. It's just, it's built into the culture, and I find it really interesting too. And then this is kind of a weird of a side, but it kind of bolts in here, is that I was watching a documentary about Russian. So in Russia for 70 years now, they've been domesticating foxes. It's the most bizarre. I don't know why I got into this documentary. It was one of those Netflix nights, right? But it was like, it's the domestication of foxes. And they had this lady who was like 95 years old or something. And they went through the whole war, everything. And they had this whole program where it was like, you take 2 foxes, you put, one, you put them next to a cage, you walk up to them. This lady would just stick her hand up to it. And the fox would either go, and like go crazy, or it would just back away, or one would just kind of get closer. They take that one, they'd breed it with the other one. They got closer. They did that for 70 years, right?
Right.
Now they have foxes that have fluffy tails, smaller ears. They run up on you. They want to be held. They want to be, they're like pets, they're the best.
Right. Yeah.
And I started doing research. I'm like, well, it's like after 7 generations, it's an inherited trait. And I'm thinking, well, that's true for humans too. So I'm thinking like, so 7 generations ago, like, I don't like spiders, man. I'm going to tell you straight up right now, like, I don't like them at all. So like, so does that mean 7 generations ago, my ancestor got bit by a spider and like lost his leg or died or something, and like that's built into me. So if you think about that in terms of the phenomenon and consciousness, it's like, it's not hard to build us into these different phases or build us up from wherever we're at, because if 7 generations is an inherited trait, it's there, man.
Absolutely. And many people, they have at least been able to trace it back 3 or 4 already, right? After that, it's kind of hard because you're getting kind of far back in history.
Right.
But it's gone that far. It really makes you think it's gone longer. And it's funny you mentioned spiders, by the way, because yes, I think it could very well be. I'm not a fan either.
See, nobody, I don't think anybody goes, yeah, I love spiders. I've never heard anybody say that.
So I have 2 interesting points about spiders. Number one, I think you're right that it could very well be. In fact, I'm really fascinated by sort of energetic overlays that become part of our identity that are actually ancestral, right? That maybe happened a long time ago. And I don't think it's even as simple as sort of straight DNA genetics, the way that modern science, I think, is sometimes more of kind of like an energetic overlay.
Yeah, definitely.
But on top of that, it's funny. I have a very clear memory when I was young. My mom saw a spider like crawling and she like screamed bloody murder. And when you're 3, you get the picture.
Yeah.
Not spiders, no good.
Yeah.
Like terror.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that I know that impacted me. It's like I look back and that's one of those memories etched in my memory,
Oh, yeah.
But speaking of that, this is my second point about spiders. I sometimes feel like almost synchronistically, one of the messages I feel like I get sometimes from somewhere, from some intelligence is, okay, if you're serious about this, then next time you see a spider, how are you going to react? Or something else. And so, John, I'm telling you, I've seen quite a few spiders recently. And I have to actually get a piece of paper, let them get on the paper, and take them outside.
I've been fucking doing that too, man.
I won't kill them.
I've been doing it too.
I know that on the one hand, I feel abject terror.
Yeah.
But the other part of me goes, this is a consciousness lesson here, that if a, like my friend Stuart Davis, he had a 7-foot tall praying mantis, up here before him.
Ooh.
If I'm ready for that, then I better be able to handle
a spider,
2-centimeter spider crawling across my desk. So, I'm trying to overcome that sort of like creature fear kind of thing.
Oh my God. And I've been doing it too, but weird synchronicity is that last night I'm in the garage. I look down, spider, it was 100 degrees yesterday. I'm not wearing a shirt. Spider on my arm bites me. Watch it
really
bite me in my arm. And I'm like, you know,
right.
Fuck you. You know, right. you're done. Like, I don't care what you are. But I'm like, duh. And then I'd like get the alcohol and I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to lose my arm anymore, you know, immediately freak out. But I'm like, what the fuck? You know, like, how does it end up right, you know, right on my arm?
Did you flinch to make it bite, or did it just bite by itself?
No, but when I looked down, it was just, and I'm like, oh, you motherfucker. Yeah.
Oh, wow. You saw the moment where it actually bit.
Yeah. And I'm like, God damn. You know, I was just like, oh, and thank God. I mean, nothing's been going on. It's just a little red. And I think it was more red because I hit it so hard. I was just, right. This is not going to live. It's just boom, you know, like, but it was just such a shock. And it was, you know, it wasn't small. So, you know, but yeah, no, I totally been really trying. And I've been trying with my daughter too. She's like 3, and I think, you know, she goes to the sitter, and she's the lady who watches is an amazing Italian woman. She's, you know, awesome. But as soon as she sees any type of bug, she's like, kill it. Whatever. Right. So, you know, Stella, she'll see something and she's like, kill it. I'm like, whoa, hey, I'm trying to teach her, like, look, if it's not trying to kill you, don't try to kill it. You know, like, leave it alone. Right. Like, just, it's not hurting you at all. But she's like, I think I'm trying to build that into her, you know, by
especially if we really are trying to prep people that there's an ecosystem that goes way beyond us. We're somewhere like in the halfway point. And if our instinct is to just kill everything that like is inconvenient or looks a little strange,
what's going on?
How hypocritical are we to say these things are evil and they just want to kill us? And I'm like, well, what are we doing? What kind of lesson are we, you know, teaching? Yeah.
Nukes. What are we doing to the whole?
Yeah, we don't just kill others, we kill ourselves. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's completely full circle, because if we can't take care of ourselves, or, you know, and that's interesting too, because when you talk about ants, you know, I can't remember who said it, but I actually heard it recently. It was like, you know, I mean, whatever this consciousness is, or these other beings, like, they wanted to have a conversation. It's like, do we want to walk outside and have a conversation with a mound of ants that you just walked over? Like, we could be on that scale. We could literally be on that scale, like you just said. Like, to them, we are just these things running around when they got much other things to do that are way above us consciously, or whatever. So
yeah, but the thing is, I mean, I mentioned that in one of my podcasts. Maybe that's what you remember it from.
Maybe it was. Yeah.
But sorry. I mean, the sort of the point being was that, you know, when we say, what if they think about us like a mound of ants, like we do of a mound of ants?
Right.
The challenge there is that we're assuming they think like we do. Right. Oh. So there's 2 questions. It's not just, do they comparatively see us like a mound of ants compared to them in terms of like level of intelligence or something like that?
Right.
But there's a second question, which most people don't ask, which is, if you're at a different level of consciousness, then you look at a mound of ants very differently, you know, than you would otherwise. So it's not just, you know, where do we fit in the scale, them to us, but also if they are closer to a sense of oneness, and, you know, they see themselves as, you know, here to be guides and to help birth new developmental levels for species below them, which to me makes a ton of sense based on the spectrum of consciousness, that the more advanced you become, the more you actually recognize and value all aspects of consciousness,
right,
and at all levels. And so that's the point I was making there, was that, you know, it's not just, do they see us as much less intelligent than them, but I'm saying if you're at a higher level of consciousness, then the way you look at less intelligent species completely changes.
Completely.
Yeah.
That's a great point, man. And that it is awesome. I had to have heard it from yours. Podcast, because your podcast rocks, and I really appreciate you taking the time and hanging out with me tonight, man.
This has been fun. We're gonna have to do it again.
Oh, we're gonna have to do it multiple times, and we got James to thank. Indoli, I mean, that guy, Engaging the Phenomenon. I mean, he reached out to me and was like, John, you should make a podcast. I'm like, no way, dude. He's like, no, you should do it. That guy, I don't know what consciousness or what planet or whatever that dude came from, but man, he's a treasure. I mean, seriously. I mean, did he do the same thing to you? Did he go, hey, man?
That's what's so funny.
I knew it.
And I looked back at when your podcast began. It was like late last year kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. It was like October, November or something like that.
Mine was December. So it happened almost the exact same time. So
yeah, he was like, you can do it, man.
He's been secretly going around and running a seeding program, clearly.
Oh yeah, dude, I'm telling you, I don't know whatever touched him when you know, or whatever happened to him, but that guy he's got it, man. You know, he's
a networker, and
for sure
he has this ability to, to try and hold space for different people coming from different levels, different backgrounds, different belief systems, and try and get everyone to, be at the table together. And that's rare. And especially in virtual spaces, the Twitter sphere and stuff like that, it's really valuable.
It's huge, man. It's very huge. It's very huge. I mean, like, he actually believed in me, and with that, I believed in myself, and I was like, I'm going to do it. And,
exactly.
And honest to God, because of him, there's the only reason I'm doing it. I keep telling him that all the time. And I tell him, and I keep telling him too, that if the van comes, picks me up, it's his fucking fault. He's got to come bail me out.
That's right.
Because I was like scared, the whole time. I'm like, man, people just get put away. Like, people get just told to shut up. When I grew up, it was like the Men in Black was a real thing. It was before Will Smith and all that. It was like, no, man, you have an accident, you fall down some stairs, your car gets crashed, you have
stuff that's really hard to trace. Exactly.
Yeah. You commit suicide, things like that. You have a heart attack, it's just like really weird. And I was like, man, I don't know if I get into this. I'm really passionate about it, but I don't know. I don't want to do this. But, he was the kind of guy that was like, I should do it. Just do it. And he pushed me to do it. I mean, like, he literally held my hand. He's like, no, you can do it. He's like, look, this is how you do this. I'm like, really? I'm like, I don't know. Look, you can do this and this. But amazing, dude. That's so great that he did that for you as well. I'm glad, because now you and I are talking, and your contribution to the entire thing is amazing. And dude, thank you for what you do every day. And I appreciate your podcast, and I'm glad I can get to talk to you and be a small part of it at some point. But man, thanks a bunch.
I thank you too, John. And it's great to make your acquaintance. And we'll definitely do it again. And maybe even do it with me, you, and James several times too, eh?
That would be perfect, man. Get him on here. That would be awesome. And then he could explain to us what he did.
Exactly. Show us your grand plan.
Yeah. What level of consciousness did you tap into to find us and bring us? And what are we supposed to do now?
Right.
That's awesome, dude. Thank you so much.
All right, John. Thanks. Take care.
All right.